Andrew, your name is pretty much synonymous with the kind of politics of the field, and in terms of your writing and the various things that you've actually done in the field of psychotherapy over, 20 or 30 years. In this conversation, we're going to divide it up into politics and therapy, politics in therapy, and politics of therapy. So if we start out first with politics and therapy, would you like to say something about your history and what you've done around, for example, PCSR, psychotherapists and counsellors for social responsibility, Antidote, etc.?
Yeah, let me begin by saying, if my name is synonymous with this, whilst that makes me feel good, it's a problem. It shouldn't be, because it shouldn't be synonymous, because you know, Hillman and Ventura wrote that book in the 90s. We've had 100 years of psychotherapy, and the world is getting worse. But in fact, that title is academic nonsense. We've had 100 years of psychotherapy trying to change the world, and the world has basically stayed much the same.
Yes, yeah.
So it's an old project. Freud and Jung. I've been reading early Rogers on society and on Marx. All the pioneers were as interested in culture and social change as in individual therapy to relieve people's personal distress. So it's been around a long time. There's Ronnie Lang, there's Red Therapy, there's the Marx-Freud project, there's the Frankfurt School. Why hasn't it worked? You know, we invite the world into therapy and it didn't turn up for its first session, is something I'm sick of saying. Probably audiences are sick of hearing. I'll tell you why I think. Because we split off the therapy practice, the things we do and know about working with people, from our big ideas. And so we try to take our big ideas about psyche and about the unconscious and so forth, or about defenses, and we whop them up against a social and political problem, and then we're surprised and hurt that the social and political problem quietly turns its back on us. We need to use the interactive, dialogical way of working that is characteristic of therapy, but we need to use that in the political and social arena. And I think if we do that, we have a better chance of being attended to. And we need to be modest. We need to recognize that therapists on their own are not going to change the world. You know, I'd like to see a therapist on every important committee, but a committee of therapists in the political area? God save us. Heaven help us, exactly. So using what we do on a daily basis and its living nature to help us understand political and social issues and work with other people involved in those issues, that is a modest and viable approach, and that's what psychotherapists and counsellors for social responsibility was set up to do.
So that is, so what you've just described there, you have been working in that way?
Yes, people are working, not just me, but people are working with regard to Middle Eastern politics, back in the day with regard to South Africa, immigration and asylum and refugee issues, economic inequality, class and poverty. I could go on and on and on. Yes. There are little bits of this happening. The difficulty is, as with all progressive movements, that the opponents, the powerful, are much better organized and united than we ever are. We spend so much time arguing in PCSR memorably as to whether to put the chairs in a circle or not before we begin to have a discussion about something, that it's risible. And the baddies have their act together. It was always thus, though, wasn't it? I mean, you know, that's just the case.
Yes,
but this is a huge problem for those of us who want to bring therapy thinking to political problems.
Yes. So to what extent would you say that you've been successful in actually doing that? Antidote, for example, was quite active in the 90s. I haven't heard nearly so much more recently.
Antidote has become interested more in education, and it's just quite well thought of there.
Yes.
As we've both been saying ruefully, because I think we share some interests here, some passions, it hasn't been all that successful. I personally have been successful as a political consultant to political leaders, including very well-known ones in this country and right at the top in the United States. Lovely for me, and I think I made a contribution and all the rest of it. But it doesn't exactly fit with the picture I painted earlier about modest toiling alongside other people.
Yes, yes.
And there are others in the therapy world who've similarly got consultancies and advisorships and all the rest of it. Well, I did this because the opportunity arose and it interested me, and I saw no reason why I shouldn't pursue it. What's been most interesting there, though, has been which bits of my knowledge they want.
Yes.
Above all,
Yes.
because these are senior men and women in the political world, they want stuff on leadership over and over and over again. If Obama wants to be the father of the nation, trading off Abraham Lincoln's use of Cicero's, was it Cicero anyway, somebody's phrase, the father of the nation, what do rather literal-minded political advisors do? They think, well, which psychologists, or as they call us, behavioral scientists, I'm a behavioral scientist, apparently, which behavioral scientists can tell us something about fathers? And so I've been working with politicians about using new ideas about nurturing fathers whose authority doesn't come from physical strength and money. Those ideas are directly applicable to anybody who, as a leader, is contemplating trying to unite a nation. So that's the level and the topic that I find my services are most required or most demanded over.
I mean, I was going to ask you about leadership and the whole theme of that, and you've spoken to that. Thinking about other kind of current themes that might be relevant. What about the economy? And I always want to say stupid after I say that phrase. Is there something to say about that?
Yeah, I do. I think I do. I wrote a paper on the economy entitled "It's the Psychology Stupid." And I still found this very interesting, and I did a lot of experiential work as the basis for this, looking at differences according to gender in how people perceive the economic and financial issues and how they experience and handle money. And I've found a lot of interest in banks and financial regulators in talking with me about, for example, gender and cultural differences with regard to money, because at the level where these things are thought about in the wider society, not in the therapy world, there is a unit, a person, who is simply monolithic. There's no diversity within or about that person. The person isn't always male, but it's definitely a single variant. And getting money people to realize how personal money is. I don't mean as in personal finance, that just means personal finance as opposed to the government's finance or a corporation's finance, but how deeply emotional these matters are.
Yes,
it's a real shock I once gave a talk to an audience of personal financial advisors, and they were absolutely stunned by the idea that, for example, anxiety might actually have a sort of fundamental impact on people's choices in terms of the products they might buy. So I think the economy and those sorts of issues are really fruitful areas for therapists who want to bring their kind of thinking to bear.
Yes, and of course the area which has been a real growth area in recent years has been the whole area of eco-psychology and ecological issues,
Yes.
which I assume that therapy hopefully has kind of quite a lot to say about that.
Aha. Well,
again, it's a complex one.
Yeah, no, I want to say something here. I'm going to do it via a story, and then I think I won't say any more about it. Yes.
Yeah.
I was invited to an eco-psychology gathering, and I gave a talk on perfume. And I began by asking, there were about 135, 140 people in the room. I began by asking which of them read women's or men's fashion and grooming magazines like Vogue or GQ or whatever. None. One person said she occasionally guiltily read Vogue in the dentist's waiting room. And then I asked who used Personal Hygiene Project, projects, personal hygiene products.
Oh, perhaps projects as
Yeah,
well, but yeah, go on.
Anyway, who used deodorant? Who used eau de cologne, perfume, whatever? Tiny number, tiny number. And then I asked a whole bunch of other questions about high heels and underwear and all that kind of thing, which probably reflect other interests of mine. But nobody. So I just told them they were weird and that they would never convey their important message, with which I agreed, to anybody because they weren't in touch with anything that had to do with these, what you might call metropolitan areas, you know, of life, deep areas. Because you know that what seems most superficial is actually most at depth in our world. Anyway, the exercise we then did was, thanks to the manager of the Selfridges perfume department, I arrived with about 50 little free samples of perfume, you know, the kind of thing, little tiny vials of perfume. And we distributed these in the groups, and everybody sort of smeared themselves and each other with perfume, and they talked about it. A few people left because they felt it was invasive. One person left because she said it made her asthmatic. Maybe that was probably true. But people did have an interesting time. The idea was to see whether artifice and nature could be reconnected in some way.
I was going to ask you what the idea was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because what's gone wrong? What's gone wrong with eco-psychology is it has lost sight of espresso culture. It's lost sight of the piazza. It's so obsessed with the pine tree that it can't deal with the piazza. People need to have what they do honoured and respected, and what they do is they read Vogue, they drink coffee, they put on perfume, they take taxis for short rides. None of this is evil. And I wrote in the book, you know, because we first met when you did the index for it, back in the early 90s, the political psyche. Yeah. You know, I wrote this thing against nature because it struck me that the environmental movement, as we used to call it then, would fail if it didn't somehow stop overpraising nature and start appreciating the goodness of the city.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right, that's...
so
yeah.
I think I'm the sort of in-house maverick problem person for the eco-psychologists, because most of them are friends of mine.
Well, I was about to say, Nick Totten and you must have some very interesting conversations about this, I would think.
We do.
Yeah. It's time maybe to move on to the second theme, which is politics in therapy.
Yes.
And would you like to say something about the issue of diversity and the therapeutic relationship? And again, diversity and pluralism is something that you've written a great deal about.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I've made a contribution here, it's in encouraging therapists to pick up on political, social and cultural themes with their clients and to engage them in what I call, against all the rules, discussion about those. Even if there's a big discrepancy of opinion between the therapist and the client, I think it's therapeutically interesting and valuable and quite doable, and it breaks the taboo on the external world, which many schools of therapy, not just the analytical ones, still have to a very considerable extent.
Yes.
Now, if you get people talking about social and political and cultural themes, what you will notice is that those are actually the diversity issues that the profession as a whole ought to be worrying about, and to some extent is worrying about. People talk about class in therapy, and they can be encouraged and facilitated to do so, and that's a diversity issue. People talk about all kinds of things to do with gender and sexuality, about power, about experimentation in these areas, and those too have something to do with the diversity and equalities agenda that we're all promoting these days, if we possibly can. So what I realized is that there's no point in making the profession more diverse if the very issues that underpin the reasons for there to be a diversity push, if you don't do something about those things in therapy, what is the point? How can you have a diversified and equalized profession whose basic work doesn't touch any of those issues at all? So it doesn't make any sense. So for me, this was quite an epiphany to realize that everything I cared about in terms of what we used to call equal ops and diversity and all that stuff, And everything I cared about broadening the therapy conversation to include political, social, and cultural issues, they're the same point. They're the same thing in a slightly different way.
And could you say when that happened for you? When that moment? Is it difficult to date that in terms of your career?
About the year 2000.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And then when I became chair of the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, and we put a huge chunk of our budget into the diversity, equalities and social responsibility area, which was, a really nice thing to be able to do from my point of view, I realized that although we were talking to some extent about who gets therapy and who trains to be therapists, we weren't talking enough about what therapists do with these kinds of thinkings. And so, but this is later, of course, this is about 2009. So the realization that the diversity agenda and working with social issues in therapy were kind of the same thing re-emerged in my thinking in about 2009, 2010.
So there's this whole thing about the balance between the personal and the political, and I suppose I'm wondering about, in terms of the way you work with your clients, how that works. That's an ongoing creative dynamic sort of tension that you're working with all the time.
Succinctly, if I'm working with a person who has racist views, I'm interested in establishing the history of those views. And all this can be done within quite normal therapy clinical approaches. There's nothing special about this. It's just the area of inquiry is special, but the actual how you do it isn't. What's the history of your virulent objection to Asians? And then I'm interested in how intensely the view that Asians are not okay, how intensely is that held? Because one of the problems is that people have all kinds of objectionable and problematic views, but sometimes one shouldn't make too much of a fuss about it because it's not that intense for them. It's one of a number of things they hold, but it's not actually the main thing about them. Okay?
Yeah.
And I suppose another way of asking this is, how central is this viewpoint?
Yes.
And then I will, if that conversation has gone well enough, I will put in my viewpoint in a discussion mode. I'll say, I want to discuss this with you. And the theory goes like this. Because we're in a therapy vessel, and to be Jungian about it, an alchemical pot, there will be strange combinations. Strange things will happen if a therapist starts to discuss with her or his client something about their racism, about the client's racism. And of course the therapist will put their own racism in too, if they're in touch with it, which many people are. What happens next is wholly unpredictable and alchemical. Something combusts, something combines, and a new product might come out. Do people go out of the room cleansed of racism? Nah, not really, but do they have a therapeutic experience, the raw material of which is a cultural and a political attitude? Yes. And I've been teaching this for a long time now, and especially in the States, people have picked it up, and they use this idea. Find out about the history of a thought in the political area that the client has, check out the intensity and centrality about it, and start a discussion in the full confidence that a discussion about politics in therapy is not like a discussion about politics in the pub, in the workplace, in the living room, or in bed. Therapy is a special place. And so if you discuss politics in therapy, it's a special kind of discussion. At least that's what I think.
Yes. No, that's very, very important, and I think you've expressed that more clearly than I've ever heard it expressed. So that's very helpful. To perhaps move on to possibly the most sort of controversial of these three themes, the politics of therapy. If I could remind you of that in 1997 I co-edited a book called Implausible Professions, and we used a quotation from yours to launch the book right at the start. And the quotation was, "This profession which is not one cannot even be named. So I'll just leave that hanging as a kind of backdrop to the kind of conversation that perhaps we're going to have now around professionalisation, and perhaps to start out by talking about regulation. It's been quite a controversial issue in the field, well, going way back into the early 70s actually. It's been around for a long time, and it keeps re-emerging in kind of different ways. You've been very involved in that in the last decade or so, the accountability issue within the field. Would you perhaps like to kind of say something about all that? I know it's a vast territory.
Yeah, I need to make a bit of a personal confession. In terms of these sorts of issues of professional organisation and relation to the wider society, including the government, psychotherapists come in two main kinds. The first kind are essentially up the backside of those who are powerful, and they are slavishly adoring and deferential of the powerful, and they'll do what they think the powerful want. They're sick. But equally sick is the second group of therapists who are quite incapable of agreeing to anything that comes from outside their own little villages, who are rabidly knee-jerk, anti-authority, adolescent,
rebels,
prone, yes.
And worked through rebel material.
They haven't worked through rebel material, and they're equally sick, and I'm in the second group. So are you. Okay? So are most of the people we know and like. So I think it's very important for those of us who have all the right progressive ideas about how the profession should name itself, organise itself, and so on, should understand that we are coming from a kinky place, just as those who only want to get jobs with the Department of Health or whatever it is are coming from an equally kinky place, but the opposite. That said, shall we proceed?
Yes. Okay. That sounds like a very
good I'm sick.
Backdrop,
I'm talking as a sick man, but the people who will disagree with me are equally sick, right?
Or we could use the word wounded healer in a more Jungian context.
Well, we could. The issue of regulation basically divided the profession along these lines, you see.
It does.
And because each of these groupings is the shadow, the disavowed part of the other, I mean, it became the most intense and intractable war. Now, when I say the two are the shadow of each other, I can well get in touch with my desire for acceptance and approval. And this came to a culmination for me when I did get the UKCP chair job, because I did get a degree of approval. And I think if you understand it psychologically, the divisions in the profession about regulation over all those years, I think you have a much better position to look at what the issues really were. And the issues really were, to what extent is there a serious public safety risk attached to what therapists do? And the next is, if there isn't a serious public safety risk, is there one that requires a response from outside the professions? And I now feel that the second question, is there a risk that requires a response but isn't a serious risk? I think there is.
So has your view shifted on that?
Yes, a little bit.
Okay.
If a form of external witness bearing could be devised, under whose benevolent yet muscled gaze the therapists can continue to organise themselves, then I support that. But I don't believe that any therapy organisation that I know, whether it's UKCP or the Independent Practitioners Network or the Society of Analytical Psychology or the British Psychoanalytical Society, could fail to benefit from some external witnessing. Now notice, I haven't said scrutiny, I haven't said assessment,
No. Witnessing is a very
I
good
haven't
word.
said approval.
Yeah.
But we are not okay on our own. We need something from outside. Now,
Yeah.
people are probably wondering, or some people are probably wondering, what I feel about the Professional Standards Authority.
Yes. Well, what I was about to say, does the state do witnessing well? That's what I was going to ask you.
Well,
Yeah.
it remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Thank goodness it hasn't been going for long enough, and I don't have to actually deliver a verdict, as it were.
Yeah.
But to me, there are some optimistic signs. There are things I don't like. Perhaps for people who don't know, the Professional Standards Authority is the British government sort of supported agency that will accredit voluntary registers of psychotherapy and counselling held by the existing voluntary bodies and charities in that field. And it's what they call light touch regulation. They don't actually get all that involved in what we do, but they definitely have standards and so forth.
Back to witnessing.
Back to witnessing. I think the problem with witnessing and the Professional Standards Authority is that they haven't yet developed the standpoint that would work well for the witnessing of what therapists do, because they come from too consumerist background.
Yes.
They're looking at it
Yes.
from the point of view of fair trading and that kind of thing.
So it's a different
Yes,
discourse, isn't
it's
it?
a different discourse, yet it's pretty damn unintrusive compared to what was
might have
originally
happened,
proposed
Yeah.
under the Health Professions
Yeah.
Council. So if I could actually persuade those who might have the ear of the Professional Standards Authority, it would be to find a more therapy-specific and therapy-congruent kind
Yes.
of witnessing,
Yes. Yes.
other than the protecting the consumer. And I think, to move this on a little bit, the other issue, I said the first question was, to what extent there's a serious problem. The second was always, to what extent does the public need protecting from us?
Yes, that's a crucial question.
And that's a very crucial question, because there is abuse by therapists, but there's also abuse by doctors and other health professionals who are already highly regulated. In other words, you can't stop bad eggs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's possible that the public doesn't need protecting in quite the way that we think it might. But that's an open and, as you said earlier, extremely complicated question.
Yes. It would be very interesting to go into that in more depth.
Yeah. But regulation is only one of a very small number of totally huge challenges that face the professions of therapy.
Yes, well, I was going to ask
counselling.
you about the whole thing about the NICE regulations, the IAPT system. I know, again, these are vast territories. I don't know whether it's possible to say anything kind of brief about those.
Yeah, NICE is the National Institute
for Clinical Excellence.
Yeah, some other word, National Institute for Clinical and something Excellence. But anyway, everyone just gets the clinical. Maybe health is in there somewhere. I don't know. It doesn't matter. NICE is another one of these slightly arm's length government bodies that sets out guidelines as to which treatments have satisfied NICE's requirements for an evidence base. And broadly speaking, government finance of psychotherapy and counselling follows the NICE guidelines. That in itself isn't a surprise. That's how the financing of all health provision is done. But NICE is a very important body in England. Now, what was the question actually?
Well, it was just a very, very general question. I mean, I could pick up on what you've just said, which would be something like, is it possible to have something like NICE guidelines for the practice of talking therapy? That would be a very important question.
Huge questions. There are some people, you might be one, who don't think that the government or the state or the Department of Health should be financing psychotherapy and counselling at all. it should be done, either people pay for themselves or there's some sort of low-cost schemes or voluntary schemes or whatever. I'm not in that camp. I actually am passionately devoted to the cause of psychotherapy and counselling on the NHS, free at the point of delivery and not subject to a postcode lottery. And so what's happening to psychotherapy and counselling in England is awful.
Absolutely.
It's awful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if the NICE guidelines support therapies A, B and C, then it is therapies A, B and C that will be offered in public sector national health settings. Therapies D, E and F may well have a very solid research-driven evidence base, but the methodology used by those researchers doesn't meet the approvals of the clinical bureaucrats who have decided that A, B and C are okay therapies. So it's not that C, D and E don't have an evidence base. They do.
Yeah.
They just don't have the right kind of evidence base. Now, what I saw when I was chair at UKCP was that actually, given how little change, how little leverage the therapy world has in any real-world interactions at all, that a realistic target was to expand the range of methodologies that NICE would accept. Because if you expand the range of methodologies and therapies D, E and F then become NICEable, then the people of this country can have those therapies. Now, I'm going to fill in the alphabet. If A, B and C, roughly speaking, are the cognitive therapies or extremely short-term versions of other kinds of therapy, then those practitioners and the researchers who back them up are sitting pretty, actually. And those of us, I'm putting myself in here, and you, who do D, E and F, the more relational, the longer term, the more difficult to research, but yet already researched very thoroughly all over the world, then the masses of people in the country won't get those. Now, I've made a distinction, which is, it sounds offensive, but I'm afraid it's widely accepted, actually. Even people who don't like all kinds of views that I have can understand what I'm saying about this. There is something I call real psychotherapy. And that is available more and more only to people who can pay. The NICE guidelines and the government's improving access to psychological therapies scheme means that provision, real psychotherapy, is being decimated. Something else is being offered in those IAPTs, which I call state therapy. I'm not saying it's rubbish. I'm saying it's not real. It's not real psychotherapy. We have got a class system now in the provision of therapy. It's a problem. It's a scandal. It is fixable. Because if you actually look how much it costs to deliver a single session of state therapy, and you look at how much it costs to deliver, let's just be ridiculous for the moment, a private session of psychoanalysis, you can see that there's much room for maneuver, wiggle room around the money here. We could do something about this. And so my current position, Richard, is quite pragmatic.
What would you say is the role of committed kind of pressure groups? I'm thinking of the Alliance for Counselling and Psychotherapy, which we've both been involved in, because we've been engaging with these issues, and there's a question about the extent to which that kind of grouping can really kind of have an influence versus the more traditional institutions of therapy, being those who are going to kind of take these arguments to the right places.
No, I think organisations like the Alliance are very useful because we've been struggling to hold together the pragmatic reformist line that I've just put forward, that if we could change the NICE guidelines and get a better system for financing real psychotherapy, this would be a boon, this would be a good thing. That's the pragmatic reformist line, and there are others who I was hinting at the top of this segment of our interview who feel that actually psychotherapy is something the state has no business in being involved with at all, and that a whole range of alternative modes of delivery of this need to be developed. The great thing about the Alliance, if I think we can both say, is that it holds both these within it. The mainstream organisations are more in the pragmatic reformist camp. Look, I wouldn't say I'm a complete poacher turned gamekeeper, but obviously if you work in an organisation at the head of it, like UKCP, for 3 years, you get a very keen sense of what you can do before you die. And what I targeted in my mind. I believe that in our lifetime we will see other kinds of therapy, real psychotherapy, finding their way into what is permitted to be offered to the people of the country. And I do think that creative minds could be applied to the financing of this, whether by a national psychotherapy scheme or whatever it happens to be. So I opted for that. But going back to my confession that I belong to the anarchic, incorrigibly rebellious end of the therapy spectrum, I also love the idea that all state provision of therapy and counselling should stop, and myriad schemes should spring up in every community, on every housing estate, in every village. So, you know, I wouldn't mind that happening either.
Yeah. We haven't got much time left. I was going to ask you specifically about your tenure of the chair of UKCP, but you've already mentioned that several times. So perhaps we could finish with you saying something about your work on pluralism and diversity. We all know that pluralism is the new sort of kid on the block, and there are some people, you know, writing about it as if it's just been just been discovered. But of course, you got there 20 years before this, because I think you first started writing about pluralism in 1995, 96,
no,
or even earlier.
Mid-80s.
Okay, so could you say something about those values and those principles, because I think they're very relevant to the whole field of therapy and politics.
I'll just say one thing about that, and then I want to say something at the end about diversity as well, because they're connected, pluralism and diversity. My model of pluralism was distinctive because it allowed for competitive bargaining between sectors, interest groups, positions, ideas, parts of the self, whatever. A lot of the more modern writing has completely missed this out. It stems from William James's pluralism, and it stems from American political theory, liberal democratic political theory of the 1950s and 60s, about how interest groups need to bargain. And this is the stuff of a healthy state discourse, if you like. I still believe this, but one of the things I've realized is that big things have no automatic privileged position. The state has no privileged position in relation to its competitive bargaining with an interest group within it. No a priori rightness. And this too is missing from a lot of the current thinking about pluralism. They haven't quite grasped that what pluralism is about is trying to find a way that people who don't agree and have very different levels of power can get along. And also, by the way, how different states, self-states, parts of the mind, parts of the psyche, which come in different sizes and with different amounts of power, that's to say energy attached to them, they have to get along too. So all that is not there. But with regard to diversity, the thing I want to talk about, because it's something that's so close to my heart still, was that huge struggle in the mid-90s to stop the psychoanalytic discrimination against lesbians, gay men. I don't think this is now really a controversial matter from the point of view of what you might call the legal level or the rules. But I do think there's a huge amount of work for the profession to do to make what you learn on a training congruent with the non-discrimination statement that that the brochure for the training has on its front cover. There's a huge amount of work to be done. One of the things I'm proudest about from UKCP days is this Black Men on the Couch series that my mate Rotimi Akinseti got going, in which black men are interviewed by black male therapists about their stuff. And you can see, I don't think I need to spell out what a challenging and creative and brilliant project that is. And I think that the profession needs to pay attention to the problem of trying to put into practice the ideals that we have perhaps too facilely espoused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, we've covered a very vast panorama in only just over 30 minutes. There's always a danger in that of staying very kind of superficial. But certainly my experience of this conversation is there's been a lot of depth as well.
Yeah, well, let me reframe it.
Lots of breadth.
Yeah,
I don't think spoken about.
I don't think the tension between superficial and deep is the relevant one. Not that it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. In 30 minutes talking about work that goes back decades, it's bound to be superficial. So I'm not too worried about that. What I feel, and in a way, this is part of an homage to my background. I do believe in overfeeding people. I really do. I am that sort of awkward mother. But if you're thinking about a group, lots of people watching, something like us, the spectacle of you and me doing this, by overfilling it, you actually allow more people to take a bite than if you are too sort of refined, serious, careful,
rigid,
covering all your bases and all that. Yeah. So let people complain that there's too much here, but the hope is that the too muchness increases the range of people who might get something out of it.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a real pleasure for me to experience this depth, breadth with you over the last half hour or so. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you.